Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Trump and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have been at the forefront of shifting China-U.S. ties from trade partners to strategic rivals. They have also framed this rivalry as a competition of ideology and governance. How will China respond to this provocation? And how will the rest of the world react to an economic decoupling and an unstable U.S.-led world order? To find out, I speak to Chen Dongxiao, president of the Shanghai Institutes of International Studies. He gives me a framework as to how China is looking at the overall situation and its future relation with the United States. Latest news suggests that there is a coalition of the willing, quote-unquote, that is aspired to be built by the current Secretary of State of the United States. Now, under that circumstances, what does that mean for China-U.S. relations? What's your latest take?
Well, I think that from those hawkish members in White House, represented by the Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, who tried to build up such kind of anti-China, or put it more precisely, anti-Communist Party, Chinese Communist Party coalition around the world. And I think that they tried to conjure up the concept, or reconstruct the concept of so-called ideological war or confrontation with what they called a kind of a tyranny governmental regime in Beijing, and they tried to mobilize those domestic sources or forces as well as international forces to try to roll back of what they called a China threat. I think that such kind of rhetorics only reminded me of those Cold War rhetoric, which has been already opposed and rejected categorically by Chinese people, by Chinese government, as well as many reasonable people, many statesmen, politicians around the world.
When one side really wants to do it, a Cold War, even though do not necessarily represent the overall population of the United States, but what can China do really?
Today's world is quite different from what Mr. Pompeo's depiction or narratives of kind of a new Cold War with China. For very obvious reasons, we are still living in a very globalized world. Interdependence, hyperconnectivity are still the defining feature of our today's world. Even if some people in Washington, those hawkish peoples, they try to pursue the policy of so-called decoupling with China. But I think that the reality is the reality. But more importantly, we're also living in a world of the diversity or pluralistic mode of development. So I think that when those people who try to say that the world will be polarized or divided into the so-called democratic countries or world versus non-democratic countries or world, I think such kind of a very simplistic framework does not catch up or does not comprehend this very complex, interdependent world. What I mean by saying the increasingly fragile or vulnerable international system, which means that the human beings' social-political system are increasingly connected with the biological system.
Logically, what you just said, and theoretically, really sound, but the reality looks the other way around. For example, some say it's all about hard power competition now between China and the United States. Don't look away from this reality. And China, as a result, you argue in your article also that it's not symmetrical. It's actually an asymmetrical competition between China and the United States. Tell me more about that.
In the past few years, there's a growing extent of the competition, also even strategic competition between our bilateral relationship. We have to admit that this strategic competition are largely reflected by the two dimensions. One is that it should be understood under the framework of a global or international power shift, that those transatlantic or US-dominated international order has been increasingly replaced by a multipolarization. And the rising of those non-transatlantic, non-Western powers have increasingly transit from their roles-taking to the position of roles-making. And therefore, this is a geopolitical or global power structure shift. And the United States represents a kind of relative decline of the force, and China represents the other side. So this is the main reason underpinning the concept why this bilateral relationship has increasingly have the dimension of a strategic competition. Chinese socialist system has improved, upgraded, and developed. And therefore, Chinese people are also confident, more confident in this system we have chosen. While at the same time, kind of by contrast, we have seen that there have been a more economic, social, and political system problems coming out of the American mode of domestic governance. And we have seen still quite serious racial problems, and seen so many demonstrations in the United States and even social unrest. So I think that the United States is politically much more polarized, and economically, its distribution of welfare system is not so unfair. It's very unfair.
Right.
And also, we have also seen the diminishing or the declining of middle class in the United States. So these are all the domestic problems for the American domestic governance. And in this kind of contrast, for many American colleagues, particularly for those hawkish people who try to divert the attention from their poor performance, including their poor performance responding to the pandemic, they try to, conjure up a kind of a fear that all those problems are coming out of the shock or challenge from China.
So why is it asymmetrical and why is it imbalanced?
Well, I think that the asymmetrical should be understood in three dimensions. In dimension of perception of both sides, and in the dimension of the instruments that both sides apply, as well as in dimension of the domestic ecosystem of each other, particularly regarding the decision-making on each other's policy towards each other. For the first aspect, I think that both sides, I think that Washington and Beijing has a gulf gap of perception, of understanding the nature of the strategic competition. For instance, from Washington's perspective, their overwhelming narrative, particularly carried by those hawkish members in the White House as well as in Congress, they try to define this relationship as a kind of as I said, ideological war, or a primacy, it's a primacy struggle, or game for primacy. And they also regard Washington played the role of a guardian or guarantor of the Western or American ideology or liberal institution or liberal ideology. So this is their definition about the strategic competition. Well, I think Beijing categorically rejected that narrative, because China has no strategic intention and planning of exporting or transplanting the Chinese mode of development, of governance around the world. And it's also not in China's strategic planning or intention to try to engage with U.S. in a so-called a Cold War, ideological war. So this is a big difference of perception. The second aspect of the asymmetrical side is the instruments. Washington nowadays has carried out its so-called strategic competition with China with all its whole of government means. Political smearing, economic decoupling, science technology boycotting, and also security or military rolling back. So they have they have applied all kinds of means through the so-called maximum pressures. And this is the reason we have seen that there are a series of those hardliner policies on China almost day by day. While from Chinese perspective, I think that we mainly focus on those areas of competition on how to continue to improve our economic development and the science and technology competitiveness. And we also focus on how to improve or develop Chinese own domestic governance. So I think that if we compare the instruments of how to understand, how to carry on those competition, the both sides have quite a diverse stress and emphasis. And the last but not least is the quite a diverse political atmosphere of two sides. For Washington, I think that particularly nowadays, because this the presidential election has intensified the uncertainty and unpredictability of Americans' political atmosphere. And I think that those intensity of those election, while also the sitting government increasingly frustrated about the performance and the declining of its support, will make those decision-making on China even more dramatic, risk-taking, and unpredictable.
China's reform and opening up has been closely linked to China's normalizing relation with the United States. In fact, that was done almost at the same time in the 1970s with China's reform and opening up decision. And over the past 4-5 decades, China's development has a lot to do with its opening door, its ever more intertwined relationship with the United States, its involvement on the international platforms. Now, if one of those factors is being taken away, particularly China-U.S. relations, from partner to a certain extent to real competition and even rivalry, what would that mean to the other factors of our development?
But we should not forget that actually this relationship is very complex. And don't forget there is still a huge area or even potential area for our cooperation and for partnership. The challenge for us is nowadays, on the current administration of the U.S., that those areas for cooperation has been almost suspended unilaterally by the United States. Even China has been trying very hard to try to work with the U.S. on many important areas, either bilaterally or multilaterally. So I think that the reality is we, of course, would not, it is not in the Chinese interest to pursue the so-called new Cold War with U.S. We will continue, because this kind of new Cold War has focused too much on so-called ideological differences or even confrontation. And it is also largely coming out of U.S. domestic politics. But I don't think that it will succeed, because China rejects the idea, this ideological war, and China is only interested in its own development. And China also has no interest to export its mode of governance around the world. And we focus on the mutual learning, including the mutual learning of different countries' mode of development, including the United States. And I also believe that the other players including many Americans, allies and partners, they are not ready to side either with the U.S. or with China because they don't think that it is in their interest to side with either side or against another. Even in the United States, now we have seen that the sitting government, particularly its hawkish members, they try to frame this bilateral relationship with this overwhelming rhetorics of narratives of Cold War or ideological confrontation.
Right.
But I think that for many reasonable people, as well as many business people, still have a close economic relationship with China. They don't think that it is in their interest to join this force of anti-China or engage with the so-called new Cold War with China. From Chinese perspective, I think that while we understand that there will be a more pressure from U.S. side to try to roll back of what they believe a kind of a China challenge. And we will respond with firmness as well as rationality.
Right.
We try to strike a good balance between firmness and rationality. And if we compare the statements of our Foreign Minister Wang Yi's and U.S. State Secretary Pompeo's, it's not so difficult to find that the Trump administration has been gone all out to provoking, whereas Chinese government reacted with firmness and calmness.
Chen Dongxiao, president of the Shanghai Institute of International Studies. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, search our program, World Insight, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.